Every morning before the sun fully woke the street, the same small figure walked past the boarded bus stop and the cracked fire hydrant. A black girl, no older than 12, moving carefully so the paper bag in her hands wouldn't tear. Inside it, 2 eggs wrapped in foil, a slice of toast, and a small cup of warm oatmeal. Nothing fancy, just enough to say someone thought about you. She stopped at the same house every day. Most people pretended that house didn't exist. The paint was peeling like it had given up years ago. One window was patched with cardboard. Grass grew wild around the steps as if the place had been slowly erased from the neighborhood's memory. An old man lived there, quiet, bent-backed, always alone. The kind of man people warned their children about without knowing why. The girl never knocked loudly, just a soft tap. Sometimes he opened the door, sometimes he didn't. When he didn't, she left the breakfast on the step, straightened the bag, and whispered, "See you tomorrow," like a promise. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. They whispered at the corner store. They shook their heads on the sidewalk. Why does she keep going there? Her mama should stop her. That man's got a past. But the girl kept coming. Rain didn't stop her. Cold mornings didn't stop her. Even the day someone yelled that she was wasting food on someone who didn't matter, she still showed up. Then one morning, everything changed. She had just tied her shoes for school when a shadow crossed the doorway. Her mother opened the door, expecting a neighbor or a bill collector. Instead, 2 military officers stood on the porch. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces were serious, and behind them the entire street seemed to freeze. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, phones quietly lifted. The girl felt her stomach drop. Military officers didn't come to houses like hers for no reason. The taller one asked her name. The other glanced down at a small notebook, then back at her with something unreadable in his eyes, respect maybe, or regret. "We're here about your morning visits," he said calmly. Her mother's face went pale. The neighbors leaned closer. The girl's hands clenched into fists. In that moment, everyone assumed the same thing. That kindness had finally gotten her into trouble. What they didn't know, what none of them were ready for, was that those breakfasts had awakened a truth buried for decades. And once it came out, this street would never see that old man or that little black girl the same way again. The girl's name was Aaliyah Carter, and she had learned early that mornings told the truth about people. At 5:30 every day, while most of the neighborhood still slept, Aaliyah was already awake, not because she wanted to be, but because life had trained her that if you wanted something done right, you had to do it yourself. She moved quietly through the small apartment she shared with her mother, careful not to wake her. The floor creaked in the same 2 places. The kettle rattled before it boiled. These sounds were familiar, like old friends who never surprised you. Aaliyah wasn't poor in the way people on television showed it. There were no dramatic cries, no empty refrigerator scenes. But there was counting eggs, counting slices of bread, counting the days until her mother's next paycheck. There was the quiet math of survival. Her mother, Renee Carter, worked double shifts at a nursing facility. She came home tired in her bones, the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. She loved her daughter fiercely, but love didn't stretch money, and it didn't slow time. Renee worried constantly about bills, about safety, about raising a black girl in a world that noticed her only when something went wrong. Aaliyah knew this. That was why she never asked for much. She learned to make breakfast by watching, first for herself, then one day for someone else. The old man's house sat 3 blocks away, right where the sidewalk dipped and the streetlights flickered longer than they should. His name was Mr. Elijah Thomas, though most people didn't use it anymore. They just called him that old man or the one in the broken house. Years ago, he had been something else, someone else. But time had thinned him down, shaved away whatever made him visible. Now he walked slowly, shoulders curved inward, eyes fixed on the ground like it had something to say to him that no one else could hear. People remembered pieces of him, but never the whole story. They remembered the shouting once, years back. They remembered an argument with city officials. They remembered that he didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't explain himself. And in a neighborhood already worn down by disappointment, that was enough to turn mystery into judgment. Aaliyah first noticed him on a cold morning when she was 10. He was sitting on his porch steps, hands shaking slightly as he tried to open a can of soup. Something about the way he struggled, quietly, stubbornly, stayed with her. He didn't ask for help. He didn't look around. He just kept trying like failure was something he accepted as normal. That night, Aaliyah couldn't sleep. She thought about her father. He had been gone for 3 years now, not gone in the way that let you hope, gone in the way that left questions sitting heavy in your chest. Her father had been a man of few words, but one thing he used to say stuck with her. Don't wait for the world to tell you who deserves kindness. The next morning, she made an extra sandwich. That was how it started. At first, Mr. Thomas didn't say much. A nod, a quiet thank you. Sometimes not even that. He looked embarrassed, like her presence reminded him of something he'd lost. But Aaliyah never stayed long enough to make it awkward. She dropped the food, smiled, and left. Routine made it safe. But the neighborhood noticed. At the corner store, people talked. On stoops, heads shook. At church, whispers followed. Why that man? Doesn't she know better? Some people don't want saving. Aaliyah felt it when she walked past groups of adults who went quiet as she approached. She heard it when kids repeated what their parents said at dinner. She even felt it at home, when her mother hesitated one morning and asked, carefully, where the extra bread had gone. Aaliyah didn't lie. She just said, I gave it to someone who needed it. Renee looked at her daughter for a long moment. Fear flickered across her face, not anger, not disapproval. Fear. The kind that comes from knowing how dangerous the world could be to a black child with a good heart. Just be careful, she said finally. That was permission enough. The tension grew slowly, like pressure under the surface. Someone scolded Aaliyah outright one afternoon, telling her she didn't know what kind of man Mr. Thomas was. Another neighbor muttered that kindness didn't change the past, but no one ever explained what the past actually was. Mr. Thomas noticed the shift before Aaliyah did. One morning, he didn't open the door. When she came back the next day, he asked her, quietly, almost gently, to stop coming. You don't need trouble tied to your name, he said. Aaliyah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something beneath the rough edges. Not danger, not guilt, just a man carrying more weight than his body could handle. I'll be fine, she said. What she didn't know was that the street was already watching more closely than ever. And that kindness, real kindness, never stays invisible for long. The morning everything shifted began like all the others, quiet, gray, and heavy with unspoken things. Aaliyah stepped out of her apartment just as the sun started pushing weak light between the buildings. The air smelled like damp concrete and old leaves. She adjusted the straps of her backpack and tightened her grip around the brown paper bag in her hand. Inside were 2 scrambled eggs wrapped in foil, toast folded carefully so it wouldn't break, and a small apple she'd wiped clean on her sleeve. She had almost skipped the apple. Food had been running low that week. Her mother hadn't said it out loud, but Aaliyah heard it in the way Renee sighed when she checked the fridge, in the way she lingered too long over grocery receipts. But when Aaliyah pictured Mr. Thomas sitting alone on his porch, hands shaking as he tried to open another can, she put the apple back in the bag. Some choices didn't feel like choices at all. The street was already awake when she reached his block. A delivery truck idled near the corner. 2 women talked loudly by a parked car. A man swept his front steps, watching her over the top of his broom. Aaliyah felt it immediately, the shift. Eyes followed her longer than usual. Conversations slowed. Someone stopped sweeping altogether. She kept walking, pretending not to notice, but her shoulders tightened without her permission. Mr. Thomas's house looked worse than it had the day before. A city notice had been taped crookedly to the door, the bright orange paper impossible to miss. The edges fluttered slightly in the breeze, loud in their silence. Aaliyah stopped. Her heart thumped once hard. She climbed the steps slowly and knocked, softer than usual. No answer. She knocked again. Nothing. She hesitated, then gently placed the bag beside the door, nudging it out of the wind. She reached for the apple, then paused. After a moment, she tucked it back inside. She straightened the bag, folded the top closed, and whispered, I'll come back later. As she turned to leave, a voice cut through the air. Hey, you. It was sharp, adult, unfriendly. Aaliyah froze. She turned and saw Mrs. Kincaid, the woman from 2 houses down, standing with her arms crossed. Her mouth was tight, eyes hard with something that looked like long-held irritation finally finding a target. I've been meaning to talk to you. Mrs. Kincaid said, loud enough for others to hear. Aaliyah swallowed. Yes, ma'am. You come here every morning, she continued, stepping closer. Every single morning. You don't think that looks strange? Aaliyah's fingers curled into her sleeves. I'm just bringing breakfast. For him, Mrs. Kincaid said, nodding sharply at the house. Of all people. A man across the street paused his sweeping again. The women by the car went quiet. The delivery truck idled on. Aaliyah felt heat rush to her face. He needs it. Mrs. Kincaid laughed, but there was no humor in it. You don't know what he needs, and you sure don't know who he is. I know he's hungry, Aaliyah said, her voice shaking despite her effort. That man is trouble, Mrs. Kincaid snapped. Always has been. Folks like you don't get it until it's too late. Aaliyah stared at her, confused. What did he do? Mrs. Kincaid hesitated, just a beat too long. That's not your business, she said finally. What is your business is school, home, staying out of grown folks' mess. Something in Aaliyah's chest tightened. If he did something, she said carefully, why won't anyone say what it was? Silence stretched between them. The woman's jaw clenched. You're being disrespectful. I'm being honest, Aaliyah replied before she could stop herself. That was when Mrs. Kincaid's voice rose. You think bringing him food makes you some kind of hero, she said loudly. You think kindness erases the past. Aaliyah's eyes burned. She glanced around, realizing how many people had gathered, how many were listening, judging. I'm not trying to erase anything, she said. I'm just... Then stop, Mrs. Kincaid interrupted, before you drag your mother into something she doesn't need. That did it. Aaliyah felt something snap, not anger exactly, but resolve. My mother taught me to help people, she said, and if nobody else is helping him, then I will. Mrs. Kincaid stared at her like she was something stubborn and inconvenient. You're too young to understand consequences. Aaliyah didn't answer. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. She didn't look back, but she felt the weight of the street pressing in on her, heavier with every step. By the time she reached school, her hands were still shaking. She couldn't focus in class. Numbers blurred together. Words on the board refused to settle into meaning. All she could see was the orange notice on Mr. Thomas's door and hear Mrs. Kincaid's voice echoing in her head. Trouble. The past. Too late. At lunch, she barely touched her food. Her friend Jamila leaned over. You okay? Aaliyah nodded automatically, then shook her head. People are mad at me. For what? For helping someone they don't like. Jamila frowned. That's dumb. Aaliyah almost smiled. After school, she didn't go straight home. She went back to Mr. Thomas's house. The notice was still there, untouched, louder now in the afternoon light. Aaliyah knocked harder this time. After a long moment, the door creaked open. Mr. Thomas stood there, eyes tired, shoulders slumped like the weight of the world had finally bent him in half. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. They're saying things, Aaliyah replied, about you. He sighed, a deep, worn-out sound. I figured. What happened? She asked. Why does everyone act like you're dangerous? Mr. Thomas looked past her, down the street where people pretended not to watch. His jaw tightened. Because it's easier, he said. Easier than remembering. Remembering what? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached up and slowly peeled the notice off his door. The tape made a sharp tearing sound in the quiet air. They're coming for the house, he said. Say it's not safe. Say I don't belong here anymore. Aaliyah's chest ached. Where will you go? Mr. Thomas gave a sad smile. That's the part no one cares about. She hesitated, then said softly, You told me to stop coming. Is this why? Yes. So people won't be mad. So you won't be, he replied. You don't deserve the looks, the whispers, the blame. Aaliyah stepped closer. I don't mind. Mr. Thomas's eyes glistened just slightly. You should. Before she could respond, a voice rang out from across the street. I knew it. Mrs. Kincaid stood there again, hands on her hips. I knew you wouldn't listen. This is between us, Mr. Thomas said, his voice firmer now. No, it isn't, she snapped. This whole street has had enough. More people appeared, drawn by the tension like gravity. Someone muttered agreement, someone else nodded. Aaliyah felt very small. "This child doesn't belong here," Mrs. Kincaid said, "and you know it." Mr. Thomas straightened as much as his body allowed. "Leave her alone." "Then stop letting her play savior," the woman shot back. "We all know how this ends." Aaliyah looked between them, heart racing. "How does it end?" she asked. No one answered. Not because they didn't hear her, but because saying the truth out loud would mean admitting they never really knew it at all. And somewhere down the street, unseen, a decision had already been made, one that would soon pull uniforms, authority, and long-buried history straight to Aaliyah's front door. The crowd didn't disperse after that question. It never did when fear was mixed with curiosity. People stayed planted where they were, pretending they had reasons, trash to take out, phones to check, steps to sweep, anything except the truth. They wanted to see what would happen next. Aaliyah felt it in the air, thick and uncomfortable. The way silence leaned forward. The way no one answered her because answering meant owning something ugly. Mr. Thomas was the first to break it. "You should go home," he said softly to Aaliyah without looking at her. "This has gone far enough." "No," she said, surprising even herself. "They're talking about you like you're not standing right here." Mrs. Kincaid scoffed. "Because he doesn't listen, never has." Mr. Thomas turned slowly toward her. His eyes weren't angry, they were tired. "You never asked." A murmur rippled through the group. "Asked what?" someone muttered. "Asked what really happened," he replied. "That did it." Mrs. Kincaid stepped forward. "We remember plenty," she said. "We remember police cars, we remember shouting, we remember you coming back different." Aaliyah's heart pounded. She looked up at Mr. Thomas. "Different how?" He closed his eyes briefly, as if steadying himself. "Broken," he said. The word landed heavy. A man near the curb crossed his arms. "You don't get to play victim now." Mr. Thomas nodded slowly. "You're right, I don't." That answer unsettled them more than denial ever could. Aaliyah felt something shift. She had expected excuses, anger. Instead, there was acceptance. And somehow that made the whispers quieter. Mrs. Kincaid shook her head. "This is exactly why she shouldn't be here. You drag people into your mess." "My mess?" Mr. Thomas echoed, a note of steel creeping into his voice. "Or the mess you all decided was easier not to understand?" Aaliyah took a step closer to him without thinking. The movement didn't go unnoticed. "See," Mrs. Kincaid snapped, "you're already pulling her in." "I walked here on my own," Aaliyah said. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "Nobody pulled me." Mrs. Kincaid turned on her. "You think you know better than grown folks." "I think," Aaliyah said carefully, "that nobody ever asked him what he needed. They just decided." A hush fell again. Mr. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression cracked. "You don't owe me this," he said quietly. "I know," Aaliyah replied. "That's why I do it." The words hit harder than anyone expected. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted their weight. Mrs. Kincaid exhaled sharply. "This is pointless. I'm calling your mother." "Go ahead," Aaliyah said. That stopped her. "You think this is brave?" Mrs. Kincaid asked. "You think standing here fixes anything?" "No," Aaliyah said, "but leaving doesn't either." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then from the far end of the street, a car slowed. It wasn't loud, it didn't rush, but its presence was felt. A dark sedan rolled to a stop, idling just long enough for people to notice. A man inside glanced toward the gathering crowd, then toward Mr. Thomas's house. Aaliyah noticed Mr. Thomas stiffen. "Who is that?" she whispered. He didn't answer. The car pulled away, disappearing around the corner. Something cold settled in Aaliyah's stomach. Mrs. Kincaid seemed satisfied. "See, this is what happens. Attention brings consequences." Mr. Thomas finally looked at her fully. "You think consequences are new to me?" She hesitated. "You think we didn't suffer too?" Mr. Thomas nodded slowly. "I know you did." That wasn't what she expected. "You think I don't hear the whispers?" he continued. "You think I don't see how you all look at me? I live with it every day. I just chose not to shout back." Aaliyah felt tears sting her eyes. "So why let me come?" she asked. Mr. Thomas's voice dropped. "Because you didn't look at me like I was something to be endured." That was when the crowd truly fell silent. Mrs. Kincaid's expression flickered, something uncertain, something uncomfortable, but she masked it quickly. This conversation is over. She turned away, motioning for others to disperse. Slowly, reluctantly, they did. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Doors closed. Windows slid shut. But the damage had been done. Aaliyah stayed. Mr. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, suddenly looking every one of his years. "You should have listened to me," he said softly. "I don't regret it," she replied. He studied her for a long moment. "You don't know what you've stepped into." "Then tell me," Aaliyah said. Mr. Thomas sighed. "Not here." She nodded. "Tomorrow." He hesitated, then finally tomorrow. That night, Aaliyah barely slept. She replayed every word, every look. The car at the end of the street, the notice on the door. The way Mr. Thomas had said broken like it was a permanent condition. Her mother noticed immediately the next morning. "You're quiet," Renee said as she poured coffee. Aaliyah swallowed. "People were yelling yesterday." Renee froze. "Where?" "By Mr. Thomas's house." Renee set the mug down slowly. "Aaliyah." "I didn't do anything wrong," Aaliyah said quickly. I know," Renee interrupted gently, "but knowing doesn't stop people from blaming." Aaliyah looked down. "Are you mad?" Renee reached out, lifting her daughter's chin. "I'm scared," she said honestly. "There's a difference." Aaliyah nodded. When she stepped outside later that morning, the street felt different. Quieter, heavier, like it was waiting. She walked to Mr. Thomas's house with the breakfast bag clenched tight in her hand. The door opened before she knocked. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He glanced down the street, then back at her. "You need to know something." She waited. "They've been asking questions," he continued. "Not neighbors, officials." Aaliyah's breath caught. "About what?" "About me," he said. "About where I was, what I did, what I never talked about." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. "Is that bad?" "It depends," Mr. Thomas said, "on whether truth is still allowed to matter." Before she could respond, a voice echoed down the street. "Aaliyah Carter." She turned. A uniformed officer stood near the curb, not aggressive, not smiling, just observant. Mr. Thomas went very still. The officer took a step forward. "Your mother asked us to check on you." Aaliyah's heart hammered. "Why?" The officer looked at Mr. Thomas, then back at her. "Because sometimes," he said carefully, "kindness brings history back with it." More uniforms appeared behind him. Not many, just enough. Enough to make the street hold its breath. Enough to make Aaliyah realize that whatever Mr. Thomas had been carrying, it was finally catching up. And that the breakfasts she thought were small had somehow become part of something much bigger, something official, something long overdue, something no one on that street could ignore anymore. The confrontation hadn't ended. It had only begun. The uniforms didn't move closer at first. They didn't need to. Their presence alone changed the temperature of the street. Aaliyah stood frozen, the breakfast bag hanging from her hand like she'd forgotten it was there. The officer who had called her name remained by the curb, posture relaxed but deliberate, as if every movement had already been measured and approved by someone unseen. Mr. Thomas stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Aaliyah and the street without making a show of it. His back straightened just enough to signal intent. "She's with me," he said. The officer nodded. "We know." That single sentence unsettled Aaliyah more than anything else. She looked up at Mr. Thomas. "They know what?" He didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the officer. Another uniformed figure approached, older than the first, his expression lined with years of discipline and restraint. He glanced at the house, the notice taped crookedly to the door, the bag in Aaliyah's hand. "You must be Elijah Thomas," the older officer said. Mr. Thomas exhaled slowly. "I am." No one spoke for a moment. The street watched from a distance again, pretending not to stare. Curtains twitched. A few people who had sworn they were done with the drama suddenly found reasons to linger. "We're not here to cause trouble," the older officer said finally, "but we do need to talk." Aaliyah's heart pounded. "Is he in trouble?" she blurted out. Both officers turned toward her. No, the younger one said quickly. Not for what you're thinking. Mr. Thomas glanced down at Aaliyah, then back up. You shouldn't involve her. We didn't, the older officer replied. She involved herself consistently. That word consistently hung in the air. Aaliyah swallowed. I just brought food. Yes, the officer said. Every morning, same time, same place. Aaliyah's stomach dropped. How do you know that? He didn't answer directly. Your mother was concerned. That made sense, and somehow made it worse. Mr. Thomas shook his head. You should have left it alone. We tried, the officer said calmly, for a long time. Aaliyah's mind raced. A long time meant before her, before the breakfasts, before the whispers. What does any of this have to do with me? She asked quietly. The older officer studied her for a moment, not coldly, thoughtfully. Because sometimes, he said, the smallest actions reopen the biggest files. Mr. Thomas closed his eyes. That was the first time Aaliyah saw fear on him. Not panic, not shame, but something deeper. The fear of being seen again after learning how to survive by disappearing. I told you to stop coming, he said almost to himself. Aaliyah felt a sharp sting behind her eyes. I didn't think. No, he interrupted gently. You didn't, and that's not your fault. The younger officer shifted his weight. We don't need to do this out here. Too late for that, Mr. Thomas replied, glancing toward the watching neighbors. The older officer nodded once. You're right. He turned slightly, addressing the street without raising his voice. This is a private matter. Please go back to your homes. Some hesitated, a few moved, others stayed just long enough to hear one more sentence. Mr. Thomas looked tired suddenly, older than before. You should go to school, he told Aaliyah. She shook her head. I'm not leaving you. The officer's eyebrow lifted slightly. Mr. Thomas gave a sad smile. You don't even know what you're protecting. I know who, she replied. That was enough. The older officer cleared his throat. We're here because your name came up during a review. Review of what? Aaliyah asked. Service records, he said. The word landed with weight. Aaliyah blinked. Service. Mr. Thomas's shoulders sagged. You were in the military? She asked, turning to him. He didn't answer. The officer continued carefully. There were discrepancies, commendations that never made it into the public file, incident reports that were sealed and forgotten. Mrs. Kincaid's front door creaked open a few inches. She froze when she saw the uniform still there. Mr. Thomas finally spoke. Some things are better left buried. Not when they're incomplete, the officer replied. Aaliyah's mind reeled. Military, service, commendations. None of it matched the picture the neighborhood had painted. Why didn't you tell anyone? She asked softly. Mr. Thomas looked at her then. Because when I came back, nobody wanted the whole story, just the parts that made sense to them. The younger officer nodded. That was common. The street felt quieter now, not with curiosity but discomfort. The older officer glanced at the house again. You've been living alone a long time. Yes. With limited support. Yes. And no one checked on you, he added. Mr. Thomas didn't answer. Aaliyah clenched her fists. That's not fair. The officer looked at her. No, it is. A car slowed at the corner. Someone whispered behind a curtain. The street could feel it now, something shifting away from certainty. We need to verify some things, the officer said to Mr. Thomas, and we need to make sure you're safe. I've managed, Mr. Thomas replied. Barely, the officer said, not unkindly. Aaliyah stepped forward. He's not dangerous. The younger officer met her gaze. We know. That word again. Mr. Thomas laughed quietly, without humor. After all these years. The older officer looked at him steadily. History has a way of resurfacing when someone finally treats it like it matters. Aaliyah felt a strange mix of pride and fear twist in her chest. So what happens now? She asked. The officer hesitated. Now, he said, we start asking the questions that should have been asked a long time ago. Mr. Thomas nodded slowly, resignation and relief tangled together. And the street. The officer glanced around. They'll have to listen. Aaliyah looked at the houses she'd grown up around. The people who had warned her, judged her, watched her. For the first time, she realized something important. They were afraid now. Not of Mr. Thomas, of what they might have to admit once the truth came out. And as the officers turned slightly toward the house, preparing to step inside, Aaliyah understood that the quiet routine she had built with simple breakfasts was gone forever. In its place stood questions, uniforms, and a past that refused to stay hidden any longer. This wasn't the end of her kindness. It was the moment it became impossible to ignore. The officers stepped inside Mr. Thomas's house slowly, not as intruders but as witnesses. Aaliyah followed without being asked, her heart beating hard against her ribs. The air inside smelled faintly of dust, old books, and something metallic she couldn't place. The living room was small, sparsely furnished. A worn couch, a coffee table with scratches that told stories of years passing without repair. On one wall hung a single framed photograph, its glass slightly cracked. The older officer noticed it immediately. "That's you," he said quietly. Mr. Thomas nodded. "A long time ago." Aaliyah stepped closer. The photo showed a younger version of the man she knew, back straight, eyes alert, wearing a uniform she had only seen in history books and movies. He looked proud, whole, like someone who belonged somewhere. "You never showed me this," she whispered. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," Mr. Thomas replied. The younger officer scanned the room, his gaze respectful. "You kept everything," he said, "even when no one asked." Mr. Thomas shrugged. "Some things you don't throw away, even when they hurt." Outside, the street had gone unnaturally quiet. People lingered at windows, pretending not to stare but listening for any hint of raised voices. None came. That silence unsettled them more than shouting ever could. Inside, the older officer pulled a folder from under his arm. He didn't open it yet. "Mr. Thomas," he said, "do you remember Sergeant Daniels?" Mr. Thomas's shoulders stiffened. "Yes." "He passed away last year," the officer continued. "Before he did, he requested a review of several sealed reports." Aaliyah felt the room tighten. "Why?" Mr. Thomas asked. "Because he said history had been recorded wrong," the officer replied. "And because he said you carried the cost of that mistake." Mr. Thomas lowered himself slowly onto the couch. His hands trembled slightly, and he pressed them together to steady them. Aaliyah sat beside him without thinking. "They said I was unstable," Mr. Thomas murmured. "Said what happened was my fault." The younger officer nodded. "That was the summary." "And now," Mr. Thomas asked. "Now we know it wasn't the whole truth," the officer said, "and the parts that were missing matter." Aaliyah's chest ached. She looked at Mr. Thomas, imagining him younger, trusting a system that later turned its back on him. "So people thought," she began. "They thought what was easiest," Mr. Thomas finished. "That I broke, that I couldn't handle coming home." The older officer finally opened the folder. Papers rustled softly. "You saved lives," he said. "More than one, and you followed orders that never should have been given." Mr. Thomas closed his eyes. Outside, Mrs. Kincaid stood on her porch now, arms folded tight, watching the door like it might open and accuse her directly. Her certainty had begun to crack, replaced by something uncomfortable, doubt. Inside, Aaliyah felt tears spill over. "Then why did everyone hate you?" Mr. Thomas looked at her with a sad smile. "Because heroes make people uncomfortable when they don't fit the story they want." The younger officer glanced at Aaliyah. "Your visits brought attention. Someone noticed the routine, asked why a child was checking on a man everyone else ignored." "And that led to this?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "It led back to records no one bothered to reopen." Mr. Thomas laughed softly. "All because of breakfast." Aaliyah shook her head. "Because of care." A knock sounded at the door. All three froze. The older officer moved first, opening it carefully. Renee stood there, breathless, fear written across her face. "Aaliyah," she said, rushing in and pulling her daughter into a tight hug. "I was so worried." "I'm okay," Aaliyah said quickly. "Mom, they're not here to arrest him." Renee looked up, confusion replacing panic. The officer spoke gently. "Ma'am, your daughter did nothing wrong." Renee exhaled shakily. "Then why are you here?" "Because," he said, "she did something very right." Renee looked at Mr. Thomas, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. "You served," she said quietly. Mr. Thomas nodded. A long time ago. I'm sorry, Renee said after a moment, for not knowing. Outside, the door closing behind Renee echoed down the street. People leaned forward. They could see her now, standing calmly, not yelling, not crying. That confused them. The officers stepped back onto the porch with Mr. Thomas, Aaliyah, and Renee beside him. The street seemed to hold its breath. The older officer spoke clearly, not loudly. We'll be returning, he said. There are things that need to be corrected. Corrected how? Someone called out. With honesty, he replied. Mrs. Kincaid's face flushed. So that's it, we're just supposed to forget. Mr. Thomas met her gaze. No, he said, you're supposed to remember properly. Silence followed. The officers left soon after, their cars disappearing down the street without sirens, without drama. But the quiet they left behind was heavier than noise. Aaliyah stood on the porch, looking out at the people who had judged her, warned her, pitied her. No one spoke. Later that night, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the sidewalk, Mr. Thomas sat alone again, but something had changed. The house felt less empty, less forgotten. Aaliyah returned once more before dinner, this time without food. I wanted to check on you, she said. Mr. Thomas smiled faintly. I think I'll be all right. You're not invisible anymore, she said. He nodded, neither are you. Down the street, Mrs. Kincaid watched from her window, her reflection staring back at her. For the first time, she didn't know what to think. And in that uncertainty, the real rising action took hold. Not in uniforms or files, but in the slow, uncomfortable awakening of a community forced to face the truth it had ignored. The past was no longer buried, and the future, uncertain as it was, had begun to demand accountability. The day the truth finally came into the open did not begin with sirens or speeches. It began with silence. Not the ordinary quiet of early morning, but the heavy, expectant stillness that settles when something irreversible is about to happen. Aaliyah felt it before she saw anything different. She stood at her bedroom window, backpack at her feet, watching the street below. People were already outside, too early, too alert. Neighbors who usually rushed to work now lingered. Conversations were hushed, movements cautious. The air itself seemed to be waiting. Down the block, Mr. Thomas's house stood unchanged, yet somehow no longer invisible. Her mother came up behind her. They're coming back today, Renee said softly. Aaliyah nodded, I know. She didn't ask how her mother knew. Everyone knew. When the first military vehicle turned onto the street, no one spoke. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world. Another followed, then a third. They parked neatly along the curb, not blocking driveways, not asserting dominance, just arriving. Uniformed officers stepped out, more than before. Older ones, higher ranks. Their presence carried weight, history, and a sense of formality that sent a ripple through the crowd. Mrs. Kincaid stepped onto her porch, her face tight. Others followed. People who had crossed the street to avoid Mr. Thomas now found themselves unable to look away. Aaliyah walked toward his house, her steps steady but her heart racing. Mr. Thomas was already on the porch. He wore a clean button-down shirt she had never seen before. His shoes were polished, though worn. His hands rested at his sides, trembling just slightly. He looked smaller than usual and stronger at the same time. You don't have to do this, Aaliyah said quietly as she reached him. Yes, he replied, I do. The officers approached together. The highest-ranking among them stopped a few steps away and stood at attention. Elijah Thomas, he said clearly, his voice carrying down the street. Sir. That single word, sir, sent a visible shock through the crowd. Mr. Thomas straightened instinctively. We are here, the officer continued, to correct a failure. He paused, letting the words settle. For decades, he said, your service was recorded incompletely, your actions misunderstood, your sacrifice minimized. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Mrs. Kincaid's brow furrowed. Sacrifice, she whispered. The officer turned slightly so everyone could hear. During his deployment, Mr. Thomas followed orders that placed him and his unit in impossible circumstances. When the consequences came, responsibility was shifted downward. Mr. Thomas closed his eyes. He was blamed, the officer said, for surviving. Aaliyah felt her breath catch. The officer continued. While others returned to recognition, he returned to silence. Another officer stepped forward, holding a folded flag. "Mr. Thomas," the first officer said, "you were awarded commendations that never reached you, honors that were delayed by bureaucracy, fear, and neglect." He held out a small case. Medals glinted in the sunlight. The street seemed to tilt. "No," Mr. Thomas whispered. "That was years ago." "Yes," the officer replied, "and that is why we are here now." He opened the case. "For bravery under fire. For saving lives. For leadership when leadership failed." Each phrase landed like a blow to the chest. Aaliyah looked around. Faces had changed. Mouths hung slightly open. The story they had told themselves for years was cracking. Mrs. Kincaid's hands shook. "You knew," someone muttered, "all this time." Mr. Thomas finally spoke. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." The officer met his gaze. It always mattered. He raised his hand. Every officer snapped into a salute. The sound was sharp, unified, final. Mr. Thomas froze. For a moment he didn't know what to do. His hands hovered uncertainly at his sides. Then muscle memory took over. Slowly, carefully, he returned the salute. Aaliyah felt tears spill down her face. The crowd was silent. No whispers, no phones, no excuses. Just truth. The officer lowered his hand. "On behalf of a system that failed you," he said, "and a country that forgot you, we apologize." Mr. Thomas's shoulders trembled. "I didn't want apologies," he said hoarsely. "I wanted to be left alone." The officer nodded. "And that should have been your choice, not the result of abandonment." Mrs. Kincaid stepped forward, her voice barely steady. "All these years we thought." She trailed off. Mr. Thomas looked at her. "You thought what you were told and what you needed to believe." Her eyes filled with tears. "We treated you like a burden," he finished calmly. "I know." She shook her head. "I'm sorry." He studied her for a long moment. "So am I." The officer turned slightly, gesturing toward Aaliyah. "There is one more reason we are here." Every eye shifted to her. Aaliyah froze. "This young woman," the officer said, "acted with compassion when no one else did, without knowing the story, without expecting recognition." He paused. Her actions prompted questions. Those questions reopened files. Those files revealed the truth. Aaliyah's face burned. She shook her head. "I just brought breakfast." The officer smiled gently. "You brought dignity." The word echoed. Mr. Thomas looked down at her, eyes shining. "You reminded me I was still human." Something broke then, not loudly but completely. The street that had once judged in silence now stood exposed by it. People shifted, some cried openly, others stared at the ground. No one argued. The officer closed the case and handed it to Mr. Thomas. "These belong to you." Mr. Thomas took them with trembling hands. "I don't know what to do with this," he admitted. The officer replied softly, "You already did." Aaliyah reached for his hand. He squeezed back. In that moment, the old narrative died. Not because it was challenged, but because it could no longer survive the truth standing in daylight. The uniforms began to disperse, salutes exchanged, heads bowed respectfully. As the vehicles pulled away, the street remained frozen. No one clapped, no one cheered. Because this wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. Mr. Thomas sat slowly on the porch steps, the metal case resting in his lap. Aaliyah sat beside him. "I'm scared," she admitted. He nodded. "Me too." "But not like before," she added. He smiled faintly. "No, not like before." Mrs. Kincaid approached again, hesitating. Can I sit?" Mr. Thomas shifted slightly. "If you want to listen." She sat. Others followed, not crowding, not demanding forgiveness, just sitting, sharing space. The sun rose higher. And for the first time in decades, Elijah Thomas was no longer carrying his history alone. The truth had come, and nothing on that street would ever be the same again. The days after the officers left felt unfamiliar, like the neighborhood had woken up inside a different story. Nothing looked different at first. The same cracked sidewalks, the same leaning streetlight, the same houses packed close together, holding years of private struggles behind thin walls, but the way people moved through the space had changed. Conversations slowed, eyes lingered longer, and for the first time in a long while, no one pretended Mr. Thomas's house wasn't there. Aaliyah noticed it immediately. On the morning after the ceremony, she stepped outside with her backpack slung over one shoulder and froze. Someone had trimmed the wild grass around Mr. Thomas's steps. The city noticed that once screamed neglect was gone. In its place sat a small potted plant, green and uncertain, like it didn't yet know if it was allowed to stay. She smiled before she could stop herself. Mr. Thomas opened his door just as she reached the porch. "You didn't bring breakfast," he said gently. "I didn't think you'd need it today," Aaliyah replied. He nodded. "You're probably right." He looked different, not younger, not suddenly healed, but steadier, like a man who no longer had to brace himself for being misunderstood. The medals were nowhere in sight. He hadn't put them on display. They rested inside the house, still unfamiliar, still heavy with meaning. "People keep stopping by," he said quietly. "Some to apologize, some to ask questions." "And?" Aaliyah asked. "And I'm tired," he admitted, "but not lonely." That mattered. Across the street, Mrs. Kincaid watched from her porch, uncertainty etched into her face. For years, she had been loud in her judgments, confident in her version of the truth. Now, stripped of that certainty, she didn't quite know where to place herself. That afternoon, she crossed the street. Aaliyah saw her coming and stiffened, instinctively preparing for confrontation. But Mrs. Kincaid didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse, didn't defend herself. "I brought soup," she said, holding out a container toward Mr. Thomas. "If you want it." Mr. Thomas studied her for a long moment. The silence felt heavy but not hostile. "Come in," he said finally. Aaliyah stayed on the porch, heart pounding, unsure what forgiveness was supposed to look like when it arrived so quietly. Inside, voices stayed low. There was no dramatic apology, no sudden transformation, just awkward honesty, followed by longer pauses than anyone was used to. That was how healing began on that street, not with declarations, but with discomfort. At home, Renee watched her daughter more closely than usual. "You okay?" she asked one night as they folded laundry together. Aaliyah nodded. "I think so." Renee hesitated. "What you did, it mattered, but I want you to understand something." Aaliyah looked up. "Kindness doesn't mean carrying everything alone," Renee said. "You're allowed to let other people step up too." Aaliyah considered that. For so long, she had believed that doing the right thing meant doing it quietly, without help. Seeing the neighborhood finally move, however imperfectly, was teaching her something new. At school, teachers pulled her aside. Word had traveled faster than she expected. One counselor asked, carefully, "How does it feel to be part of something so big?" Aaliyah thought about it. "It doesn't feel big," she said. "It feels like something that should have happened a long time ago." That answer stayed with the counselor long after Aaliyah left the room. Mr. Thomas began receiving visits from officials, not to inspect or threaten, but to assist. Repairs were scheduled, benefits explained, resources offered without condescension. Still, he approached every meeting with caution, like a man who had learned the cost of trust. One afternoon, Aaliyah found him sitting on the porch, staring down the street. "Do you ever wish it had stayed quiet?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "quiet was easier. But quiet almost erased me." She nodded. They sat together as the sun dipped low, shadows stretching across the pavement. Children rode bikes past his house now without being pulled back by anxious parents. Someone waved, someone else nodded. Small things, powerful things. Weeks passed. The street found a new rhythm, not perfect, not redeemed, but more honest. Mrs. Kincaid volunteered to help organize a block meeting, not to control the narrative, but to listen. For the first time, people shared stories without rushing to judgment. They spoke about fear, about assumptions, about how easily silence became cruelty when no one questioned it. Mr. Thomas spoke once. "I didn't ask to be a symbol," he said calmly. "I just wanted to exist without being punished for surviving." No one interrupted him. Aaliyah sat beside her mother, listening, understanding that justice didn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrived as acknowledgement. One evening, Mr. Thomas knocked on Aaliyah's door. Renee answered, surprised. "I wanted to return something," he said, holding out a small paper bag. Inside was a breakfast. "I made it," he said. "Not very good, but I tried." Aaliyah laughed, tears in her eyes. "Thank you." He nodded. "You reminded me how to take care of myself." As he turned to leave, Renee stopped him. "You're welcome here," she said. "Any time." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and smiled. The house that once stood as a warning now stood as a reminder of how easily people disappear when no one bothers to look closely, of how powerful it is when someone does. Aaliyah walked to school the next morning without a paper bag in her hand for the first time in years. It felt strange, lighter, but not empty. She glanced back once at Mr. Thomas's house. He stood on the porch, watching the street wake up, not hidden, not alone, not forgotten. And as she turned the corner, Aaliyah understood something she would carry with her long after childhood faded. Kindness didn't just change one life. It taught an entire community how to see again. This story reminds us that the most dangerous injustice is not always loud cruelty. It is quiet neglect. It is the moment we decide we already know someone's story without ever asking them to speak. It is when assumptions replace empathy and silence becomes permission for harm. Mr. Thomas was not invisible because he had nothing to offer. He was made invisible because people found it easier to judge than to understand. Fear, stereotypes, and convenience allowed a community to look past a human being and see only a label. And once a person is reduced to a label, mistreatment begins to feel justified. But change did not arrive through power or authority. It arrived through conscience. Aaliyah did not have money, influence, or status. What she had was awareness, the courage to question what everyone else accepted as normal. She noticed what others ignored. She chose curiosity over comfort, compassion over compliance. And in doing so, she proved that moral courage does not require age, permission, or perfection. It requires honesty. The moral truth is simple, yet uncomfortable. Doing nothing is a choice, and it often sides with injustice. This story teaches that kindness is not weakness. It is resistance. It disrupts false narratives. It forces truth into places where lies have settled comfortably. Aaliyah's kindness did not fix everything overnight, but it cracked open a system built on silence, and that was enough to start real change. We also learned that accountability is not about humiliation. It is about recognition. The community did not heal when people were shamed. It healed when they listened, when they admitted they were wrong, when they allowed themselves to feel the weight of what they had ignored. Most importantly, this story reminds us that dignity is not earned. It is inherent. No one should have to prove their worth to deserve basic humanity. When we treat people as problems instead of people, we become part of the harm, even if we believe we are just following rules. The moral message is clear. Look again, ask questions, speak up. Because sometimes the smallest voice, the one brave enough to care, is the one that restores an entire community's conscience. And when we choose to see each other fully, justice doesn't arrive as punishment. It arrives as recognition. That is where real change begins.